All right, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, November 26th, and I figure maybe we can start with Ukraine again. There's just so much chatter about this peace plan. I know we've gone from a 28-point peace plan to a 19-point peace plan, but I think maybe we could just start, like, if we step back and just say, should we even be talking about a peace plan? Is it even possible for a peace plan? Because let's just say that the Americans exercise the leverage they have and force Zelensky to agree to whatever deal. I mean, this is always a big problem. Zelensky doesn't agree to any plan, but if we just use our leverage and agree
Right.
to it, in what world will the Russians really accept any plan that is put forward by the Americans? I mean, let's just take one of Russia's core demands, the no NATO for Ukraine. Okay, well, we promised that before. I mean, we promised not 1 inch to the east from the beginning. We had Minsk 1, Minsk 2. There was a neutrality clause written into Ukraine's constitution when it was founded that said Ukraine would be a permanently neutral state that does not participate in military blocs. You know, we had an Istanbul peace deal at the beginning of the war, and when Ukraine did want to make peace, we blew it up. So in what world would a peace plan ever be possible if trust
Yeah.
is
Well,
gone?
okay. Well, that's right. I mean, even assuming, I guess this is the point that you're making. Let's say that the the Americans actually accept, the Russian offer, all of the Russian demands, and present, pass those on to the Ukrainians and say, look, you've got to accept all of these. Well, the Americans do have leverage when it comes to Ukraine. They clearly do. So there is a chance that they could really, force the Ukrainians to accept it. And I think we saw maybe an indication of that earlier, where it seemed that Zelensky was actually running scared. He gave some speeches, where he's sounding very, very glum, very pessimistic. It's just like we may have to lose our dignity. But then he also said that, well, the alternative is that we lose our main backer. So right there, he was admitting to the leverage that the U.S. has over him. But let's say this is just hypothetical, because this is not the 28-point peace plan. But let's say it is actually the Russian demands and they're met in full. Yeah, then we still have a problem, for the reasons that you gave. It's just that, look, the Minsk Accord was actually voted on and approved by the UN Security Council. It was supposed to be a matter of international law, and everybody was obligated to see it through, but that just didn't happen. And as you know, later we had various participants on the Western side bragging about how they never intended to implement it. So this is a serious problem, right? Is really any kind of accord possible? I think there's reason to doubt it. There's reason. I think there are many in Russia who understand that, and there's a fear that Putin could be, because he really does want to do things through diplomacy. He does really want to have a deal with the West, and that he might be suckered into, signing on the dotted line if the conditions are met. I don't know if he would. It seems like he has become, his eyes have been opened. He saw what happened. He admitted that he was wrong. He was naive when it came to Minsk. But that's actually besides the point right now, because the plan, that 28-point plan that was presented to the Ukrainians, if the versions, we haven't seen an officially released version, but if the versions that are out there are more or less correct, does deviate from the Russian demands.
Right. Well, then let's say the war just keeps on grinding on until we have to agree to Russia's demands. Right. That's basically what's happening. Is just every time a new plan comes by, more and more territory is lost, more and more men are lost, and the conditions get harsher and harsher to the point where Ukraine won't have any choice but to accept. But the problem is, I just don't think that any deal that is signed by the U.S. or the Europeans will be acknowledged. So even if that's what I'm saying, like, even if they do accept the demands, all of Russia's demands, will that be good enough for Russia?
Right.
Like, how will they know?
That's exactly what I was saying. Possibly Putin would go for it, but I think but I think many in the Kremlin would be reluctant to do that for the reasons that you stated. There is a deep suspicion of the West, and it's a well-founded suspicion.
Then what are we saying? What are we saying, that there can never be a deal, that the Ukraine just has to be utterly destroyed? I mean, that it has to be taken over?
Yeah, essentially, I think that's it. It doesn't have to be utterly destroyed, but it has to be rendered, let's say, a dysfunctional rump state. I think that's, maybe that's what the Russians are coming to understand. They essentially have to take enough of Ukraine that the remainder does not present a serious threat to them anymore. And that would, of course, include Odessa. It would include the Black Sea coast. I think that would just make it much more difficult for Ukraine to harm Russia.
So then, do you think that all this peace talk plan, 28-point plan, 19-point plan, whatever, it really is just all noise, fugazi? It doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, it won't be acceptable to Russia,
right,
because
right.
Russia, no matter what, even if we capitulate in full and just say that, okay, we're going to agree to your base demands, it's still not going to be enough. There'd have to be like complete demilitarization of Ukraine. You have to move all your missiles out. You have to move, complete neutrality.
Right.
It's
right. Well, it'd have to be close to what was nearly agreed upon in Istanbul. So that would be neutrality. Membership in NATO would be would never happen. There would have to be, again, though I don't know how you guarantee any of this. And then the cap that would be put on the military would be very severe. It'd be nothing like the 600,000 cap, which is way, way too high. I think it's clearly higher than the army they have now. So it's amazing that, again, the Westerners the West is complaining about this, but they are. Again, if actually, it's not, if they did, agree to everything, let's say like all those terms that were presented at Istanbul, that agreement that was nearly made, and in addition to the territory, the 4 additional oblasts, and they actually, not just de facto recognition, which is what this 28-point plan says, but a de jure. In other words, you accept that it's legal. Because de facto is kind of a way of saying it's not legal, and and I think it opens the door, down the road to attempts to get the territory back. Because you say, okay, we accepted for the time being, but we never said that it was all right. So it would have to be de jure recognition. Let's say if they did everything, again, I think there's a chance that Putin might actually go for it, because I think he really does want an agreement. And a lot of people worry that, worry about him in that sense, that he really does believe in diplomacy. He does believe in negotiations. He wants to have an agreement with the West. But many people around him are telling him you just can't make an agreement with the West. These people have demonstrated that they are just not, they can't be trusted. I remember actually back when Merkel came out and said that, oh, yeah, we were never serious about that. And Hollande, the former French president, also said the same thing. I was really stunned, because when they said that was a way of saying that, yeah, we don't honor agreements, openly talking about the fact that we don't honor agreements. So what you have done, you've not only, exposed what your role in the Minsk Accords, but you have declared that, that you and your government cannot be trusted to make an agreement in the future. I just thought that it was extraordinary that they would make that kind of statement, but they did. And the Russians heard it. So
what would you tell?
I don't think it's possible. It's not going to happen. I mean, again, this 28-point agreement, even, the one that everybody's claiming in the West was somehow written by the Russians, it wasn't. It clearly actually falls short of very important Russian demands. And so, they're going to reject it outright. So there's just not. And then if Trump would put himself behind it. You could say that it represents progress. Think, where we were back in the spring when they were talking about a ceasefire. And that's exactly, what the Europeans and the Ukrainians agreed to. And the Russians said, no, we're not doing that. We don't have just a ceasefire and then try to figure out we have to have a settlement before there's some kind of ceasefire. Now, this time Trump has moved much closer to the Russian position, but he's still not there.
Okay, so what would you tell Putin? That you don't trust the West, don't sign any agreement? I mean, how do we move forward? And then what does that mean? It just means that we just keep on killing Ukrainians until the whole thing falls apart? I
mean, yeah, that's the thing is like, I'm kind of sort of naive and I want to believe in the possibility of a real peace settlement. But I think the cynical part of me, which is really the more realistic part of me, knows that it just isn't possible. And I think that's probably true of Putin as well. So it is, again, like Mearsheimer said many times, it's going to end on the battlefield. And it will be a victory for the Russians, but it will be an ugly victory. And I think they're going to take the 4 oblasts. And when they do, they're going to make like a very last offer. Say, okay, we've taken them now. Are you going to accept this? Are you going to accept our terms? And almost certainly they're going to be rejected. And then they're going to go on, to these other oblasts like Kharkov and Sumy and Nikolaev and Odessa.
Okay, but like even if they do accept the terms, I think the problem is that Putin understands that in America, the establishment is ideologically driven to destroy Russia, and that extends to the establishment in Western Europe as well. Mm-hmm. He might feel that Trump is a pragmatic transactionalist and he can kind of figure out some type of deal with him. But the problem is if you make a deal with Trump, then you're just saying that the deal lasts until Trump is while he's in power. As soon as he's out of office, then it's like, okay, we'll prepare for war with Russia. It started in 2029. And I think people are talking that way. Just say, we just got to survive with the Trump presidency, and then we can get somebody back in power that's ready for war with Russia. And so we just got to hold on for another 3 years. So sorry, Ukraine. I know you're running out of people, but hang in there another 3 years, and then we'll have this grand war that we apparently are dying to have.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, that's part of it is that, you do things like you have the UN Security Council approve it, and that's supposed to make it kind of solid and makes it a part of international law. But clearly that didn't work in the case of Minsk. So what can you do? If the next administration wants to undo it, they'll find a way. There's always some ambiguity, and they'll just declare that Russia's in violation of it. That's what they'll do. And then they'll just go ahead and tear it up, like the way they've done with the various arms limitation treaties. I think that's right. I think the Russians would be very foolish. There's part of me, because the killing is so awful, that if we could stop this war now, that would be great. And I think, again, the Russians have shown flexibility on that. There was the idea of a temporary ceasefire, at least in the case of Zaporozhye and Kherson, right? But it's clear that that this is only going to be temporary. It's not going to actually end the war, and that the root causes, will not be addressed. The demands based on root causes will not be met, and the war will be fought another day. It will continue. It won't. So, the only thing they can do is just to keep on going until they get to a point where I think they feel that they've made Ukraine, they've so weakened Ukraine that Ukraine is not going to present a threat to it anymore, the kind of existential threat that it presented before. I think that Black Sea coast is very important. One of the reasons this war started is that NATO was obviously preparing to build naval bases on the Black Sea coast, the part that belongs to or is under the control of the Ukrainians. And I'm sure they'll find some way, even if you put it in the agreement, they'll find a way to try to do that again. That's something they clearly have their eyes on. And that, again, that's just one example, but that would be an existential threat to Russia. So I think, just looking at the map, that they just have to take that Black Sea coast. In other words, they have to go all the way to Odessa.
To Transnistria.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just from the Russian perspective, every major agreement over the last 30 minutes, not 30 minutes, sorry, the last 30 years
Right.
has been viewed as it been a deception or a stalling tactic or just a straight up ruse. So, and if we really want to talk about, we talk about the root causes, and Russia's always talking about the root causes, but really the real root cause here is what I just mentioned, saying that the establishment is ideologically driven to destroy Russia. And it's been that way for the past 30 years. So as long as that establishment ideology is still there, this is always will be a threat to Russia. So the reality is that establishment has to collapse. It has to fall. But I mean, when we say that, does that mean just like the whole Western hegemonic system has to fall? And that's really the part of the big battle that we're talking about, multipolarity versus U.S. hegemony. But really, that's the core root.
No, you're right, exactly. Because again, it's this unwillingness to honor treaties, this unwillingness to perform diplomacy in good faith is just a symptom of American-led Western hegemony, of the supremacist kind of thinking that came out of the unipolar moment. They began to see that. Well, in the case of Russia, I think there's two sides to it. It is this first, the sense that we won this ideological war. So it's just that our ideology, the end of history, Fukuyama, our ideology, the Western ideology is the end of history. It is the one ideology, and we're not going to really entertain any other possibilities. Anything that opposes that is just opposing history itself, essentially. And then, Russia was so weak at that time in the 90s that they got in the habit of just ignoring them. And those two things go together. Again, this supremacist thinking is really based on a perception of weakness on the part of Russia. They have to accept and they still incredibly, in spite of all that, Trump is actually like the exception. Trump and Vance, the people that put forward this 28-point plan, they're starting to, hey, well, actually, we do have to take Russian demands into account, because they, in fact, are winning. But the Europeans refuse to talk like that. They're still very much in that old mindset, and all the critics of the Trump administration still talk that way. It is this supremacist thinking that assumes that Russia is weak no matter what evidence is presented, and just assumes that we have like a moral obligation to impose our way. So when you have that kind of thinking, you're not capable of engaging in diplomacy. That thinking has to go before, Russia can have a deal, and there's just no sign that it's going to go anytime soon.
Right. The problem with the ideological thinking in the establishment is that the establishment is a permanent bureaucracy. There's nothing democratic about this. No Europeans or Americans vote for this type of foreign policy, for the expansion of NATO. Nobody here in Appalachia is like, oh man, I just can't wait till Ukraine becomes part of a NATO and then I'll be safe from Putin. That's not. It's just insane. The idea that this is somehow in America's interest is absurd. But how do we change it? Because like I said, it is a permanent bureaucracy. It's not something that we get a vote on. Every year, we have, every 4 years we have our big election and nothing changes. Nothing changes. I know.
Yeah. So I'm very pessimistic about it. I don't see in the foreseeable future, I don't see any chance of this changing.
But it has to. It has to change.
Yeah, well, you're
or
right.
else this conflict continues, right?
Well, again, it was born out of historical series of events. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. That's really what it comes in, and then the birth of the unipolar moment, and then the utter weakness of Russia during the 90s and up through the early 2000s. I think it was born of that, and they just haven't. They're still living in that past, and the only way that I can see to bring it to an end is actually for Russia to win in a way that is just cannot be denied by the West. Again, to utterly, destroy the Ukrainian army and all those NATO weapons. I don't know exactly what form it would have to take, but there would just have to be some sort of tremendous demonstration of Russian strength, and a strength that could not be denied. And then, that might be a moment of change. You can say that it happened in the case of Trump. It seems like he sort of finally realized that, wait a second, the Russians are winning. Kellogg has been lying to me. And 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 man, I don't want I have a a Biden Kabul moment here. We got to get out of this quick because this is going to be bad. That's at least the way he's thinking right now, but we'll see. He may flip again. But in general, the establishment is not with him, and not in the U.S. and certainly not in Europe. And they're still operating according to the old paradigm.
Right. Well, I mean, let's say, which is probably likely going to happen, is that Russia is just going to deliver just an undeniable victory in Ukraine, and it's over. But the Europeans, there's still, at least the elite, and not the European people, there's still this ideological fervor, this anti-Russian fervor that is baked into the establishment. So what? They'll just lick their wounds, but they'll do what they can to antagonize Russia further. One thing that actually I was just thinking about, because you mentioned in our last conversation just about the Baltic states, like Latvia and Estonia, they actually have fairly large Russian-speaking populations, but they are treated as second-class citizens now. And when I was just thinking, that's kind of almost like the beginning of Ukraine, where we had the Russian speakers in Ukraine started becoming second-class citizens. You're not allowed to speak Russian anymore, banned from the schools, and they started bombing the Donbass. What if they do the same thing now here in Latvia and Estonia, that they just say, okay, we got to persecute these Russians here more and more until the point where Russia's like, well, we got to protect the Russian people there. It's just like a potential, I'm just thinking like, okay, you didn't succeed in Ukraine. They'll try somewhere else. They'll keep going, and it's just like.
Right. There are, there is that risk. Again, the Russians, they understand what's been going on in the Baltic states, and they are not happy about it, but they've never implied that it was something that would, lead to war. Like in the case of Ukraine, they have made it clear to the West, they started making it clear to the West going back decades that, hey, this is a big red line for us. Ukraine, it's not just about the Russian minorities, but it's a real threat to us, to our existence. If we are invaded, the traditional invasion route is through Ukraine. And we've seen it happen before, and we're not going to let it happen again. They haven't made that, they haven't rung the alarm bells about the Baltic states in the same way. They of course have expressed disapproval of the treatment of the Russian minorities there, but they haven't, they regard it as a very different kind of case. It's not something that, it's something they're very unhappy about, but the Baltic states don't present an existential threat in the way that Ukraine did. So I don't think it's going to happen, but I don't know this for a fact, but I'm sure there are nationalists within Russia that do push the argument that, you just presented. They say that, we can't let our brothers suffer in these countries. We can't let them be treated as second-class citizens. You can see how that argument can be made. And I'm sure it is made, and you can see how that people could respond to that to that argument, and it may gain traction at some point. I mean, there is that danger. Yeah.
I'm just thinking that how is this conflict going to end? Ukraine will lose, is losing, is essentially lost, I feel like, and that's why they're trying to push some type of peace plan so there isn't a full-on Saigon moment or Kabul moment. But the fact is that we still have this this whole war was started because of the ideology of the West, and that's still there. This NATO expansion, this break apart Russia, destroy Russia ideology. It's not there. So even if you do finish it, I just feel like they're talking about war in 2029. Okay, well, the war, Ukraine was just the first part of it and didn't go quite well, but we learned a lot. And now we got to sort of rebuild our forces, and then maybe we can kickstart it through the Baltic states or somewhere else. Or, I just don't know. I just don't feel like.
Right. Well, you're right. I mean, I'm afraid that even I think in the end, Russia will win convincingly, but these people will be in denial, the elite, and they will not accept what's going to happen. And they're going to be thinking about ways to getting back at Russia. They'll work to build up their own militaries. They'll work to build up what remains of the Ukrainian military. And there are these flashpoints, places like Transnistria. You just mentioned Transnistria. That's something, again, these are, Russian speakers that want to be part of Russia, but they're part of Moldova. And that could become a flashpoint, especially, if the Russians go to Odessa. It could be a point where the war could begin again. There's always... the West hasn't given up on Belarus. They would like to carry out a color revolution there. It seems like Belashenko has a place under. Is that? Did I just use? No, that's not.
Lukashenko.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Lukashenko. Yeah, I knew I just said that wrong. Lukashenko.
Belarus and Lukashenko.
Yeah, I would combine the two of them. Right. He should be called Belashenko. No, he's Lukashenko. Right. Anyway. He seems to be in firm control of things there. He is, I think it's clear he's actually a very popular leader, and has been for a long time, even when there was, there hasn't been the forms of democracy there. It's just that it's been a country at peace, and that is, compared to so many other Eastern European countries, it's prospered. And the people there are, are basically Russians. They do have their own, Belarusian is not exactly Russian, but they're brother peoples. They're very, very close. And there doesn't seem to be any significant resistance to the close ties with Russia. But there is an opposition there that the West has supported. They've attempted color revolutions in the past. It was the most recent attempt that made Lukashenko realize, that he couldn't kind of straddle the fence and he had to go over on the Russian side. But again, the West hasn't given up on it. They still have their female Juan Guaido, or I should say, who is the new Nobel Peace Prize winner.
Maria Machado or something like that.
Yeah, right. Well, they have the equivalent. There's a woman who they say should be the real winner or the ruler of Belarus, and she continues to criticize Lukashenko from the sidelines, and there are always plans being laid to try to create trouble there. So anyway, I'm just saying that the West is not going to give up, and there are potential flashpoints. And so, even if the Russians win convincingly, I don't think there's any sign that the Europeans are going to say, okay, just accept the new reality, and adjust their thinking accordingly. They just have shown they have given no indication that they're going to do this.
Okay, so basically then what you're saying is that the deep state blob, the establishment, whatever it is, it can't change. So that means it has to die. It has to be defeated and fall apart, right? That's the only thing. We're not going to have it change that. So there will be sort of, maybe not directly a hot war, but essentially like a new Cold War, a new kind of Iron Curtain, and potential little flashpoints and proxies being fought between these two, right? Until there is just a collapse within the establishment.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's probably what it's going to take. It looks like to me that
how can the establishment collapse?
I don't know. I don't know, but it can. The Soviet Union collapsed. The collective West could collapse too. I mean, they have put themselves on an unsustainable trajectory. It's just that they refuse to give up the supremacist thinking, but that worked 20 years ago because they really were the unrivaled, hyperpower, the U.S. plus Western Europe. But it's over. It's just the distribution of power is changing. China is rising, Russia is rising, and much of the global South is rising too. And so they just, you look at the statistics, the population, whether it's population or share of global economy. They once had a very large share of the pie, but now it's, that their slice of the pie is getting smaller, with every year. And so this kind of thinking, is now increasingly detached from the reality. So, that's one thing. And then they're just also on, I think, clearly an unsustainable economic trajectory. It's, all of these countries are severely indebted, including the U.S. Um, and at some point, they have, I think they've just kind of developed a smugness, a sense of invincibility over the years. It's just like, okay, there used to be warnings about the debt, but then we incurred lots of debt. Nothing happened, so let's stop worrying about it. But at some point, it's going to come back and haunt them in a big way. So, whatever it is, if it's military or I think it's like we see it's a combination of all those things. We talked about the three pillars. They're losing their soft power, as they as they grow weaker, relatively weaker, it becomes it used to be that just other countries recognize their power and would willingly line up with them. They say these are the winners. We're gonna do it their way. But over time, the other countries become more and more reluctant to do that. They see that, hey, I'm not going to sacrifice my relations with China or Russia for you, because my economic relationship, my political relationship with these countries are very important. They're also very important countries. Well, how does the West react to that? They don't say, okay, yeah, the new multipolar world, you're free to do what you want. No, they try to coerce those other countries. In the past they didn't need to, but then when they take the coercive track, that anchors people, and that actually that hurts their soft power, and they become less appealing countries to say, maybe in the short run, Trump can win with his bullying tactics, but in the long run, it just makes the West, less appealing. So many countries and people, throughout the world look to the West as the way things ought to be done. They hope that would be their future. But over time, clearly it's just not nearly as true as it once used to be. There's some residual affection for the West, especially in places like Eastern Europe. It exists in other parts of the world too, but that's weakening with every passing day. So anyway, soft power is weakening. The economic power is weakening, and military too. At some point, I don't know when it is, but it just can't. The edifice can no longer stand. Those pillars get weaker and weaker. And at some point, there is going to be some kind of collapse. Maybe again we're seeing the beginnings of it in different ways. So it may just be a slow motion collapse over time. Kind of like, again, I think it was Garland Nixon. He uses the analogy of the Titanic, and how each section fills up, and then I think that's good. That's sort of what's happened. Like we hit the iceberg already. The first section's filled up. Now the second section's filling up, and the Titanic is going to be more obvious that it's sinking with every passing year.
But you think there will be just an event where it just boom, it starts to sink?
Yeah, well, ultimately there will be. Sometimes, it's kind of hard. Like, I'm just thinking about the collapse of the Roman Empire. It's really hard to say, there's certain, I guess, the sack of Rome by the Vandals or something, they say maybe that's when it really ended. But there are really several incidents, several events along the way. It didn't all happen at once. It happened gradually. In the case of Rome, it was over the course of centuries. But I think time moves a lot faster now. So it's not going to be over the course of centuries. It's going to be decades or years.
Do you think that we are moving into kind of a new Cold War era in the meantime? I think there's a possibility that there's a fiscal collapse or something like this that can sort of expedite the collapse of Western-led hegemony, and then we move into multipolarity. But if that doesn't happen, do you think that we will just kind of, the world will bifurcate, and we will have this sort of new Iron Curtain where, yeah, we're already seeing it in some, Russia's been sanctioned a lot. One thing that China had, living in China, one thing that was always a little bit annoying for me was having to always use a VPN to access things.
Yeah.
But the advantage that China had of that is that it built its own technological ecosystem. It is not reliant on any Western technology apps, whether it's social media, payment processors, whatever. They have their own system. So, and Russia is now under the sanctions into the same thing. So right. you now have two new worlds. And one thing, when I moved back from China back to the United States, I felt like the technology here in the US was outdated. I was like, man, it's so much more convenient having everything on WeChat in China, and just how fast and seamless and cheap everything was. It's a better system. So what I think will happen is that we are having this new kind of iron curtain where there's two worlds. There's the multipolar BRICS world that is using a different infrastructure, payment infrastructure, technological infrastructure, social media infrastructure, and then there is the West. And there used to be this idea of reliance that everything in the West was the best. And so many people in the West just think that innately because I'm here and it's always the best. And they think about the Iron Curtain. It's like, man, people in Russia, they just wish they had McDonald's and Coca-Cola and all that back in the Soviet Union. And it was true. But it's reversed now. Now it really is. There's so much goodness that's being made in China and Russia. It's like their cars, for example. One thing is just so frustrating. There's 100% tariff on EV vehicles. China makes some of the most fantastic EVs imaginable, and they're just on this technological, exponential path right now. So we're going to see that the West, Europe especially, and the United States as well, will just kind of be wallowing into sort of social distress and chaos, and we're not really developing, we're not manufacturing, we're spending more and more money. Meanwhile, places like Russia and China and BRICS are going to be coming up with more and more things, and we're on the outside thinking that we're still number one because we got Facebook, or whatever it is.
Right. Yeah, well, yeah, I think it's right. It's true. I mean, in Moscow and the other cities that I visited in Russia, it does seem, that they have moved into the 21st century more quickly than we have. Payment systems and robots and delivery systems and whatever. It's all there. The transportation system is just so much better than the U.S. transportation system. It's really extraordinary. And then, it's the same thing in Russia. As you mentioned, they do have their own equivalents of Facebook and whatever. So they're not utterly dependent the way that the Europeans are, for example. The Europeans don't have any of their own. That there's still this idea. I think, again, it's just the power of Western propaganda and just kind of the tendency, status quo kind of thinking, the status quo, the way things have been. That seems to, in so many people's minds, is the status quo that always wins. Oh, that's just the way things are, and they always have been. So, I'm not going to believe that, what these guys are saying about Russia and China. But I tell you, if you give them a plane ticket and you send them to Shanghai or send them to Moscow and just tell them to spend a week there, I think except for the most ideologically zealous individuals, that just everyone would come back and say, well, hey, things look pretty nice there. I mean, really, it's not at all like what I was thinking. It just isn't. And it's not just the technology, but it's the politics. Yeah, certainly China, and I think to some extent Russia, you say, is more authoritarian than the West. Though you can get into a debate about it when you talk about Germany and you find the crackdowns on free speech and Britain and other parts of Europe. But let's just say, for argument's sake. But the thing is that when it comes down to the way you live your life every day, it just seems, people don't worry about it. They have their families and their friends, and they're not afraid to express themselves within their social circles. There isn't any obvious militarization. You find actually incarceration rates in both countries are well below what they are in the U.S. Even though there's obviously a major war going on in Russia, in general, you don't feel it. There's the occasional billboard or some kind of memorial or whatever, but it's not. It's actually an exception to the rule there. It's just, in general, just life is very, very normal. And I think all of that would be a tremendous surprise to the vast majority of Westerners. They're given the sense, that these are scary places. They're not.
No, not at all. Yeah, I highly recommend anybody to take a trip to Shanghai. It's such a great city. Mm-hmm. And same with Moscow. I've only spent like a night in Moscow in the airport. It wasn't a great experience. So I need to go back to Moscow. I need to do a proper trip.
Yeah.
Okay, so then how do you see that this could just be kind of a reverse Cold War, and then it eventually just goes on until the first world becomes the third world, and the third world becomes the first world, and then we finally like, whoops, we messed up, and then the ideological sort of ruse is exposed. It's like this isn't apparently our ideology was not a good one.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd say that the Cold War has already begun. And in some ways, it's we just can call it Cold War II, the Second Cold War, and in some ways, it's actually already much more dangerous and more severe than the First Cold War. The total absence of diplomacy. That didn't exist in the First Cold War. Maybe with the exception of the very first decades of the Soviet Union. But during the last few decades, there was diplomacy and a very meaningful diplomacy between the two sides. And it was even easier for like Westerners to visit the Soviet Union or than it is now in some cases. I mean, there's
Really?
just like complete, okay, in some cases, like for example, Finland. I mean, the Finns have just shut the border with Russia. And that wasn't true back then, if I remember correctly. Now, of course, it was harder for Russians to visit the West during the first Cold War years. That's another side of it. But certainly, when you come to diplomacy, and just the hatred, the intensity of the hostility directed against Russia, I think exceeds just about anything that we saw during the first Cold War, certainly during the last, few decades of that Cold War. And so the Cold War is here, it clearly is, especially between Europe and Russia. I mean, but it does extend to China and to, into the larger multipolar world to lesser degrees.
Do you think we're going to? It's good to be drawing these parallels with the first Cold War with the Soviet Union, and that we're looking at where our system is the compromise system, the system that can't work and can't sustain itself, and that it will eventually collapse as things just get worse and worse for our people. That's what we're looking at, right? Things are just going to get worse and worse for the people in the U.S. and Europe.
Think the reason that I think it's not quite right to say that we won the first Cold War, but, the reason that we ended up, let's say, with it was more that the Soviet Union under Gorbachev, decided to bury the hatchet. And but then it was followed, clearly after that happened, that many in the former Soviet Union immediately looked to the West, including the elite within Russia, because they were wealthier. The market system produced more goods than the Soviet system did. Especially the Soviet system at the very end, it began to break down under perestroika. There was a lot of let's say unsound economic reason. They found themselves between two systems, and that just didn't work at all. So there was this huge gap in material wealth, and that was to the benefit of the West. But that is changing. I think you can say that in general, like the Western European countries are still, I mean, that's what the statistics show, and I think in general it still is true, are better off, but the gap is not huge. Just during the last, maybe it was 2 years ago, the Russians were, the categories, I think it's according to the World Bank, as being, low income, medium. They are considered a high income country, a prosperous country. Maybe they're not quite at like the standards of Germany right now, but they're very close. They're close. You feel, you go there, you see that, people aren't hurting you. They don't have as much. I think that's true. They don't own as many cars. Maybe their apartments aren't quite as large or something. And there's still a gap in material wealth, but that shrinks with every passing year. And eventually it's going to disappear. And at some point the Russians may find themselves ahead, along with the Chinese.
You said that, in large part, we can say that we kind of won the Cold War largely because the market system was better at allocating resources and we were able to produce more, and it was just an overall better system. But do we have a market system now? Why can't we don't produce diddly squat in the West anymore? And we've been seeing during the Cold War, there was the space race, there were the nuclear arms race, there was competition. Here it just seems like China and Russia's doing everything, and we just scream. And that's it,
right.
Yeah,
well,
we're not even engaged. Like, what kind of system do we have if we don't produce anything? We're supposedly, the market system supposedly won. But how did it win if we don't really have a
manufacturing base, right?
We don't have a manufacturing, right? We would say that we're a capitalist country and China's communist and Russia's authoritarian or whatever. How are we being more capitalist than the Chinese or the Russians? If capitalism should be, free market resource allocation, and it seems like that's working pretty well in China and in Russia. Here, we don't make anything. What do we make? I mean, I don't know what people. I don't even know what people do in America half the time. Like, they tell me their titles. I'm like, what does that even mean? What are you? You're just you're a data analyst, market research. What was that? You just sit there. You're being replaced by AI anyways. It's like I don't understand what it is we do.
Yeah, well, I don't really have the answer to that, but clearly there has been some kind of hollowing out. It's something that people have talked about actually for decades and warned about, the offshoring of so much industry. And now it's really come back to bite us. It was something that, again, people like Pat Buchanan and others, both on the right and the left, have pointed to and said, this is bad for us. This is where our real economic strength lies, and you're offshoring it. And now we can see, it's like Trump wants to reshore, but but it's hard. It's going to take probably decades to build things back up again. I think, part of the initial motivation for the tariffs was this idea of reshoring industries. But then he's discovered that how bad things are when he attempted that economic war, that tariff war against China. And then the Chinese just made it clear to him, hey, all of, the production, all the things that you like and want, that your people enjoy, that they expect to find in the stores, we're making them. So, this is, and we can stop sending them if you want to, if we're going to go this tariff route. And then it was at that point that, he realized, he panicked, and then he backed off. And then he tried again, and then we got, the rare earths restrictions, and then he backed off again. In other words, it just said, okay, yeah, on paper, we have in GDP terms, we're the largest economy in the world. But that clearly just, it tells me that economic measurement really doesn't mean a whole lot. It means something, but it doesn't mean a whole lot. When you look at, I believe at like all of the NATO countries together, they're in GDP terms, they're something like 25 times what Russia is. Yet Russia is outproducing them. Again, that tells me that there's some problem with the way that we're measuring economies. You go in the PPP terms, purchasing power parity. That's much more realistic, and then like the gap shrinks. But in the case of, let's say, Russia to NATO, it's still something like 10-1 if you do it that way. And yet Russia's outproducing us. So, what's going on exactly? There clearly has been a hollowing out. People point to financialization. I guess, it's not something I've studied recently, so I can't go into detail on it. It's just that so much I know it's true in the U.S. and it must be true like in the U.K. that when this offshoring process started to take off, the response was, well, okay, we don't need to do that. We can become a service economy, financial services, right? And yeah, we have to get other countries to park their money here, and we can, we have all these different interesting, financial instruments and whatever. We have real expertise in that, and you can make a great deal of money doing that. That's what we see, in London and New York. But two things, I guess. It's just that that can be replaced. You say, okay, that's something you have right now, but it's it seems like services are, in my opinion, and just, my maybe uninformed layman's opinion, can more easily be replaced than manufacturing. You just don't require the capital. You don't have to build up the whole supply chains. It's something another country can end up, doing the same thing and stealing away so much of that financial capital that you have, that you're now reliant on because you've lost the manufacturing base. And then, which makes, these efforts to weaponize the dollar or maybe to seize the Russian assets just all the more foolish. Because with each of these moves, you provide incentives for other centers to arrive outside of the West. Maybe in a Persian Gulf state, or, maybe somewhere in East Asia, who knows? Maybe in India. I mean, it's not like other countries can't do it. In the past, people are just used to, this is safe. This is a reliable place. This is where we've always parked our money. So this is where I'm going to take, our $10 billion, and this is where we're going to put it. But now they're reconsidering. When you look at them and saying, well, you can see them hungrily eyeing the Russian assets. Well, all these other governments and these major institutions around the world, they see what's going on. And they, for the first time, they reconsider, and they have already. It's not like we're talking about something just potential. It's happened already. There has been a real decline in dollar assets and euro assets over the last few years, really ever since the outbreak of the SMO, when those Russian assets were first frozen. So anyway, you can see that you can say the Western economies have become increasingly financialized. Now, the one major exception to that was Germany, but now we see the same thing happening there under Chancellor Merz, that he is actually pushing that route. And I think that's it's going to be a further hollowing out of the West.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, what you're saying about sort of the West bet on services, just that infrastructure, whether it be fintech infrastructure or whatever service infrastructure, I think it can be replaced much more rapidly now thanks to the advancements of things like blockchain and AI. A lot of these things can be automated. It'll be much more cheaper, more secure, faster. So they're able to build better systems at a faster rate, and we're stuck with an old, outdated system that's expensive and clunky and slow. So it just makes, we bet on the wrong horse with that. And I think it's so important for countries is to, have some type of specialization, like Germany. Like, we make fantastic cars, great machine tools, and you specialize in that, and you're the cutting edge, and you focus on that industry. Yeah. But now when I'm thinking about the West, what is any industry where they can say they have some type of dominance? But I can't really think of any. But what we're seeing is that China is capturing the dominance in all of these industries now because they build everything. You want the best phone, you want the best cars, pretty soon it's going to be the best planes, whatever it is. And so it's not even like a competition between the old Cold War where you had that space race and whatever. It's just like, no, it's just China's won. We're not able to do anything. And you said there was this recognition that we were hollowing out our manufacturing here through globalization, moving everything overseas, and that Trump recognized this and wanted to bring manufacturing. But what surprised me is that we recognized that there was a problem, but we'd have no ability to implement it, no common sense, rational approach. Like, what you want to do is you think about, we just talked about specialization, like, okay, where do we currently have maybe a relative advantage in some type of technology? Or where do we think is a crucial sector? Is it machine tools? Is it automotive? Is it energy? Or is it rare earths? Well, we focus on protecting that specific industry, and we can talk to other countries. We can talk to China, even be like, look, thank you so much for all the rare earths and things like that, but you understand that this is a problem, so we're going to put a small tariff on it or whatever, like this, something, so that we can start to protect our industry. And it's going to take us a decade, and I think there would be some appreciation from the West, like, okay, from other countries, from China or Russia, like, I understand that you need to develop your own thing. You right. want the wrong path by sending all of your factories to my country. We didn't ask you to put them here. You just put them here. Right. And so, like, I understand you want some of those back. So And maybe we can even help, and that will strengthen a partnership and will also reduce the risk of potential conflict in the future because we have this cooperative, symbiotic relationship now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But no, we just
Right.
say, you Bolsonaro, why'd you put him in prison? We'll put tariffs on you, Lula. We'll put tariffs on you.
Right.
We'll bomb you. Everybody gets a tariff. Everybody. It's like, well, what's the strategy?
Right.
There's no implementation.
Well, that's the problem. Sometimes, like I've said before, Trump has healthy instincts. He kind of has a partial understanding of the reality, but he doesn't have a full, let's say, fine-grained grasp of all the facts, of the full reality. And he's not a strategic thinker. That's the problem. And you need a strategic thinker for something like this, in just the way that you were describing. That's not what we have. I think also there's just a fundamental lack of humility. It's not just Trump, but it's always been true of our economic policy. It's just like whenever we would slap a tariff on China, it always has to take a punitive form. It's like we have to punish you for something. And that just harms relations. And, the other side, of course, doesn't respond very positively to that kind of thing. But if actually we're more humble and say, hey, actually we need to build up our own industry, let's focus inward, and this is why we're doing this, just to help out our own people. I think it's hard for me to believe that the Chinese and other, certainly the Chinese people would understand, because they know they were protected and their industry was built up over time, under protectionist policies. And that's true in many, many countries, that they could see that, oh, now actually the U.S. has to be more realistic. And okay, maybe, I run this business, I don't like that, but we understand. But instead, we always take the punitive route, which is, and that takes us, again, to these economic wars, these tariff wars that we can't win.
Yeah, but why? Okay, well, we know Trump, he's not a deep thinker, but he has smart people around him. Like what I'm proposing, is pretty common sense. Mm-hmm. You don't need a PhD to figure this out. Like, identify some industries that we need to develop and protect those industries for, you can do your tariffs, pinpoint them specifically just to protect this manufacturing sector, for example. Yeah. But why?
I'm sure you can find very smart individuals in the Trump administration. But it just seems like in every case, we don't really have a unified team. That's the thing. It's like Trump has appointed all kinds of people. I think, he's looking at the personal loyalty test above all, but they have differing ideologies. Maybe by and large, they may share some sort of view of, are in favor of building up American industry when it comes to economic policy, but it doesn't seem to me that they speak with a unified voice. And then no matter what, maybe have a bunch of smart people, but you have Trump at the top, always shooting at the hip and slapping tariffs on random countries. And it's kind of hard to pursue some sort of consistent long-range policy when you have a president like that.
There wasn't even an attempt. I mean, you just say manufacturing. Let's bring manufacturing back. That's it. There wasn't even an attempt at a strategy, though. It's just I just find that difficult to believe. It's like they don't want America to succeed.
Yeah. Well, part of the problem too is that, look, it does run against kind of deeply held American beliefs. A faith in the free market, and that. It's the free marketeers have, won out again and again for some good reasons, obviously, over the years. This idea that we can actually plan is really alien to American economic thinking, going way, way back. Now, what's happened, of course, is that, again, when we were the Colossus, especially at the end of World War II, having free markets was clearly in our favor, having a complete absence of trade barriers, and was on our side, was in our favor because we had the edge in virtually everything. And then if other countries did put up trade barriers of some sort, we didn't worry about it because we were so strong. You saw the Asian countries do it, and the European countries do it too, as they tried to rebuild their industries and compete once again with the U.S. Now you have these industries, especially in Asia, outcompeting the U.S. So now we're in a completely new world, but we still have the old thinking. And it's hard to abandon that thinking. I think that's part of it.
Do you think part of the problem is that when we talk about a free market, we should be looking at it within the confines of your country? There's a free market economy within your country, but once you make it the free market, the whole world, it's globalism. And then that's where you have this issue. It's like, oh, well, instead of cheap labor being down here in Mississippi, the cheap labor's in Guangzhou or it's in Anhui.
Yeah, no. That is a problem. First of all, there's the question of sovereignty and, let's say, like military technologies and supply chains, and that's something that we've discovered. We lost control of that, and it's gone over to China. So you say now, we've drawn up these war plans against China. We didn't bother to look at where our weapons are being made or many of the components are being made. And then, much to our shock, we find out that many essential components and materials like rare earths are coming from China, and the Chinese can cut them off. And so there is a sovereignty issue, that does that a country needs to take into account. If you just let again, so much manufacturing leave your country, then you make yourself vulnerable. Like in the case of a war, you certainly do. But then, that's true too, is that you depend on cheap labor overseas. Well, the working class in this country suffers. That's something, and there have been complaints, there has been recognition about that, but those people don't have much power in our country. A lot of people have been making a lot of money by closing down factories here and then setting them up in China and other countries.
Right. And then the working class becomes unskilled when it comes to manufacturing jobs.
Right.
Well.
Yeah. We used to have a very highly skilled working class, but now there's so few people in manufacturing that, we do lose a lot of those skills. And then it takes a while to acquire them again. That's part of the problem is that, okay, like markets work very well when it comes to allocating resources. This is cheaper, these fruits from Chile are cheaper, especially in the wintertime here, and we can get them. That's a great deal. Just trade makes all this possible and it efficiently allocates resources, reduces prices. But then when you're talking about entire kind of economic subsystems, different industrial ecologies, with these supply chains, you lose one of those. Say maybe like in the short run, hey, yeah, we can make a lot of money, and then for whatever reason, it's a future war or whatever. It begins to realize, man, we really need to. This industry was a serious loss to us. We need to build it up again. And then you realize, well, we can't just buy it, the way you can with the fruit or whatever. That works so well in a market. This is a social issue, and it's a long-term economic issue. How are we going to build this up again? We just let that go. It just, it was easy, painless at the point. But then when we have regrets about it, well, it's going to take decades to bring it back.
Yeah. I think there is this big issue of pride as well that's lost when you lose manufacturing. I think it's important for countries to be proud that they make something and they make something very well. Right. And I think that just contributes to the overall sickness and the malaise that we feel here in this country. It's like, what do we do exactly?
We buy things.
We buy things, and like our economy is basically like 7 companies that are trading trillions of dollars between each other, and you're just like, and you want to have that, sometimes I go to the store, I'll see something made in America. It's like a flashlight, and it's like a big deal. They make it like, this one was made in America. It's 2 times more expensive than the other flashlights, but it's made here. And it's just like, oh, that sucks. That's all we got. It's just like, this is it, that one thing. They just, in every store, you might find 1 or 2 items that are made in America. Like, we don't have that pride, and it just, I don't know if how we can get it back, because everything is just so dysfunctional. Like we said, there's these huge problems that are just entrenched now, like the unskilled labor pool, the massive amounts of debt, it just, how would people be able to afford the capital to put up to manufacture something? How could you make it cheaper than China? You just won't. And if people don't have much discretionary income right now because the economy's bad, they won't be willing to.
It's a very difficult problem. But you're right. You can't. I think you can't just focus on economic efficiency. because life is more than economics. Again, I think, the free market people are right about allocation of resources and that this is the most efficient way to run an economy. But sometimes there are huge social costs. And that is, what do you call that? That's like I forget the economic term for that. But
A negative externality?
Externality, right? Exactly. It's a negative externality. So you say it's just a recognition that, okay, yeah, like if you're looking purely at the economic transaction, this makes sense. But if it sacrifices like a whole community, hey, that's a huge social cost. That's a negative externality. And there is actually an economic concept that recognizes that. And I think that's what we need to do. Now, the solutions are not easy. I mean, it really isn't. You have to balance a lot of things. So you need people, very smart, a lot of smart people thinking hard about this. I don't have an easy answer because it's not just trade, it's also automation. That's part of the problem. But clearly, there are people that suffer because of offshoring, and it's actually the weaker people, the poorer people within our societies. And they just haven't had a voice. Now with AI, actually, that's it's getting a lot of professionals. And so maybe there's going to be a lot more screeching about that. And those people do have more power. We'll see what happens. But it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem, this general hollowing out. And it's something that we need to address. And the way not to address it is to start punishing other countries. Yeah, maybe you need tariffs. I think almost certainly that certain tariffs have to be part of the solution. But let's do it, in a constructive way. Let's not launch tariff wars. Let's not, declare that we're punishing you because you're a bad country or whatever. Let's just do it to try to build up communities again. And again, that's not easy to do, but I think we have to start thinking hard about it. Have to take steps in that direction.
I agree. I think there's a huge loss of sense of purpose on a national level and an individual level throughout the West. And there's going to be, I think, a job crisis as well. I think so many people that are working probably realize that are using AI and stuff realize it's only a matter of time before my company realizes that they don't need my analysis. That AI can do it for, right? I'm superfluous. So there's going to be this reckoning, and the flip side is that there will be new things to build and create, but I don't think it will be able to replace the amount of jobs that will be lost from AI. So there's just this. It just worries me what will people do when they have idle time and they don't have that sense of purpose. Right. It's not healthy.
Yeah, people need to be gainfully employed, and they need to make real contributions to society. And when they do, they understand it and they feel like, okay, yeah, I'm an important member of society. So we need to create those opportunities, but it can be done. I'm sure it can, but under the current circumstances, it's going to be a challenge, and we're not doing it. That's the clear thing. We're really on the wrong course.
Yeah.
Again, it's just like Trump, and I think that one of the main reasons he got elected is that he did start. He talked about these problems. A lot of, his base is actually in what we call the Rust Belt, the former manufacturing heart of the U.S. And this was a place that was sacrificed, by previous administrations. And he spoke to them, and they used to be, solidly with the Democrats. But then he ended up actually winning a lot of these votes, and that's one reason he's in office. And I think he actually does recognize it. I think that's something that he's talked about for even decades. It's not like he was just a vote getter and then he never had any. But he, again, for the reasons we've described, he's failed to carry it out because there's just this lack of strategic thinking. Above all.
Well, there's just too much attention being, focused on preserving the U.S. empire.
You're right. You need a certain humility. That's the problem. He doesn't have that humility either.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like we say, there's just so many problems and so many things that we need to fix at home, but we're just sending just the tentacles of the empire are demanding more and more because things are getting uneasy here at the edges of the empire. People are questioning things and pushing back. So we got to put more attention, more resources to bolster it up while everything crumbles within. That's what's happening. It's just so frustrating. And I think so many Americans are seeing it now, are feeling it. So many people feel betrayed by Trump, this idea of America first, or, it's just like there's nothing America first about what this administration is doing anymore. And it's just, yeah. Well, I hope we can get out of it. I hope that we can find a sense of purpose. I think there are a lot of lost souls out there, and there are going to be a lot more lost souls out there. And it's a product of, not just one thing. It's over the past 30 years, our education system pushing people out of manufacturing into kind of just sort of bogus jobs where you're just sort of pushing things around and trying to look busy to feel important. I've been in these positions. I think we know it. I think a lot of you guys know it. Like, it's how much is it? Are we really doing something meaningful? And I feel that, sometimes like when I have those days now, I do everything, work for myself on everything. So I don't feel that way as much. But like if I go out and I work outside and chop firewood, I'll feel more accomplishment from that than I did the whole week in front of my computer, because I actually did something that I know I could feel it, I could see it. Sometimes I'm wondering, like, did anything really get done? I was really stressed and busy, and I was like, thank God I'm not in that situation so much anymore. But I think a lot of people are like that, and it's not healthy. We need to find purpose and meaning again, like I said, on the national level, individual level, community level, everything. Okay, Dad, I think we can end it there.
Okay, very good.
All right, have a good rest of your day.
All right, happy Thanksgiving to everybody.
Yes,
within the U.S. and
an unhappy Thanksgiving to everybody outside.
Well, I don't mean that, but
no, happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
All right.
Okay, bye-bye.